Today, we will be discussing Michael Hill's book, Funny Business, The Legendary Life and Political Satire of Art Buchwald, published by Penguin Random House of New York in 2022, which is based in part on research using the Art Buchwald Papers collection at the library. The Buchwald collection was acquired by the library in 2017 through the generosity and devoted stewardship of Joel and Tamara Buchwald, and was processed at the library in 2019. I'm Barbara Baer, and I'm a specialist in literature, culture, and the arts in the Manuscript Division. I served as the recommending officer for the acquisition of the Art Buchwald Papers. I'm joined today by Senior Archives Specialist Colleen Benoit Kim, who led the extremely talented team of archivists that processed and organized the Art Buchwald Papers. Special Collections Events Liaison Elizabeth Schreiber-Byers is operating our Zoom and monitoring the Q&A for today's virtual event. We will be holding questions submitted through the Q&A for the end of the program. Our featured guest today is author Mike Hill. He is an independent writer and professional researcher whose past projects include a study of Minister to France Elihu Washburn and a book on humor from the Congressional Record. Hill is a seasoned researcher in the Manuscript Division of the Library of Congress, where he has delved thoroughly into numerous archival collections. He has been a research collaborator in many cultural and historical projects with scholars and longtime friends to the Library of Congress, including historians and biographers David McCullough, Jon Meacham and Michael Beschloss, documentarian Ken Burns, and others, and is the recipient of an Emmy Award for his work as a producer with Burns on the series The Civil War. In creating his new book, Funny Business, Hill mined the Art Buchwald Papers collection. He read selected correspondence and documents that had never before been available to researchers and entwined them with excerpts from personal interviews, Buchwald columns, and Buchwald's published works, examining the humor and underlying pathos of Buchwald's life and long, influential career as an American satirist and journalist. The Buchwald Papers collection is related to several other collections at the library, including those of fellow journalists, authors, editors, political cartoonists, and publishers that Buchwald lampooned, worked with, or knew. There was a time when, "Did you read Buchwald today?" was the first question that office workers asked when they gathered to chat around the water cooler, or neighbors spoke to one another over their back fences. Art Buchwald lived on this earth from 1925 to 2007. He was, as Christopher Buckley observes in his introduction to Funny Business, a mensch who made people laugh. He also made people think. Buchwald takes his place in a long line of famed American humorists who utilized the social media of their day, stemming back to fellow newspapermen like Mark Twain and Will Rogers, and forward to stand-up comics and commentators who use satire today. From Samantha Bee to Trevor Noah or Jon Stewart, or the constellation of late-night TV hosts. Buchwald wrote about and befriended celebrities, and he became a celebrity himself. He used a pudgy, cigar-smoking persona to poke fun at what mattered in American life and politics. As he said, making light of what was serious and making serious what was light. At the height of his career, Buchwald's column, based at the Washington Post, was syndicated in over 500 newspapers and read in 100 countries around the world. And he became a consummate Washington insider. In eulogizing Buchwald at his memorial service at the Kennedy Center in Washington in 2007, fellow humorist Dave Barry made a pun on the difficult craft of being a stand-up comic. He observed that Art stood up while he was sitting down at his typewriter. Indeed, as we will discuss today, Buchwald stood up in face of difficult times. The issues he once lampooned with humor are ones with which we still struggle in our society, and still see in our own headlines today. The acquisition process before the Buchwald collection was made at the library began with Joel and Tamara Buchwald organizing record center boxes full of documents in their basement. When my colleague and fellow historian Ryan Reft and I went to examine and review the materials, we found that they contained Art's manuscripts, legal documents, photographs, and poignant documentation from his early life and the beginning of his career. There were materials stemming across that very full career, from his work on a Broadway play to his ideas for a movie and his very active life beyond his radio, TV, and newspaper journalism, as a speaker and MC in high demand, as a philanthropist, and as a good friend. His correspondence files covered a stream of notable names in politics and in the journalism and entertainment industries. The acquisition process is just the first step in a collection being made at the library. The next step is the archival organization and description of the collection and preparation for readers and researchers to be able to use it. I'm going to hand the mic now over to Senior Archive Specialist Colleen Benoit Kim, who will describe the collaborative process of preparing the archival collection at the library and what struck the processing team in particular about the content of this collection.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Barbara. As Barbara mentioned earlier, my name is Colleen Benoit Kim. I served as the lead archivist managing the processing of the Art Buchwald Papers. I will spend the next several minutes describing how I and a team of 9 archivists, archive technicians, and digital conversion specialists approached organizing and describing the Buchwald collection. In doing so, I hope to not only provide some context of how we in the Manuscript Division prepare collections to facilitate their use by our readers, but also to illustrate the magnitude of the Art Buchwald Papers in both the size and the scope of the material and the amount of work that laid before Mike as he mined the collection for funny business. The collection arrived here in the Manuscript Division in March of 2019 and came to us in 189 record center boxes. Among the boxes were 234 pieces of digital media, including Art Buchwald's iBook, 42 boxes of writings, which included unpublished works and every single column ever written by Buchwald, 20 boxes of correspondence with friends, family, and professional colleagues, and some of the biggest names across American and international politics, entertainment, and journalism, 18 boxes and 8 suitcases of audiovisual material, 14 boxes of photographs and original cartoonist illustrations, 2 wardrobe boxes of oversized and framed materials, and 1 cigar. Next slide, please. When we are confronted with a large collection such as this, the first step we take is to survey the material in its original state so that we may begin to understand what is there and if there is any inherent organizational system or filing structure imposed by the creator of the material. In the case of the Buchwald Papers, we were very fortunate to find that the collection had been well maintained and well organized by his family, chiefly by his daughter-in-law, Tamara Buchwald. To boot, the collection came with a box inventory, which those of you in the biz will know is a major boon to wrapping your heads around the scope of a collection and its physical order. During the survey, we identified 9 major categories of material and as such, divided the collection into 9 series, each series reflecting a significant material type, for example, the correspondence series, or a facet of Buchwald's career, for example, the writing series. With an organizational structure decided upon, how did we go about physically arranging the material according to the structure? The short answer is teamwork. A team of 4 archivists, 1 junior fellow intern, and myself physically sorted the boxes into our 9 series, then proceeded to further arrange material within each series, folder the material, and record folder titles into container lists, all while keeping an eye out for preservation issues and addressing them as they came up. Simultaneously, a second team of archivists focused on readying the digital content and performing an inventory of the media, removing and bagging the files contained on each piece of media. And when that was complete, appraising and describing the files so that they may be available to researchers. In addition to drawing on the talents of our Manuscript Division colleagues, we consulted experts from across the library, including the Conservation Division for issues related to stability of fragile collection material, and custom housing for unique items. Remember that cigar I mentioned? We needed a special box for that. We also talked with colleagues from Preservation Services for troubleshooting tricky pieces of digital media. Once all the paper material was folded and arranged, we were ready to box the collection. Placing material into boxes represents the final physical step of making a collection ready for use. When boxing, we place the material into smaller clamshell boxes that are stored in our collection stacks and served to readers in the manuscript reading room. As you can imagine, this step, among others, is physically demanding work. Our team took turns packing material into boxes and checking the boxes against the container list. In the end, the Buchwald papers amounted to 236 clamshell boxes and 22 oversized containers, totaling close to 100 linear feet of material. With the collection physically settled into its forever home, we needed to ensure researchers could discover its contents. As I mentioned previously, as we processed the collection, we worked on our descriptive content where we could. We prepared container lists and wrote series descriptions as soon as the series were complete. We described digital content in the finding aid as soon as we reviewed files. And by the time we were done processing the material, we had most all of our pieces of the finding aid in place. The finding aid, as well as the catalog record, are available on the library's website, and you may also access them through the links provided in the chat box on today's webinar. So, how long does it take to physically arrange, folder, and describe 189 boxes of material? In this case, about 6 months. Timelines vary dramatically from collection to collection, but we were very pleased to have made the Buchwald papers available to researchers so quickly. What helped in this case was, of course, having the collection arrive in good order, but also to have several workflows running simultaneously. While our team of archivists worked on the paper portion, another team worked on the digital portion, all while we took descriptive notes and prepared container lists. We had been working on a tight deadline, with the goal of completing processing just before the close of our fiscal year of September 2019. And teamwork, as they say, made the dream work. We turned our finding aid in on September 26, 2019. I hope this lightning talk about processing the Buchwald papers was helpful in establishing the context for this truly rich collection and to illustrate the magnitude of Mike's work as he discovered and wove primary resources together to create funny business. But before I turn the program back over to Barbara, I wanted to address her question about what struck the processing team about the collection. What struck us was how complete the collection is. The collection contains his birth certificate, his memorial service program, and most everything in between. Furthermore, the collection documents his lifelong passion for and commitment to writing. Throughout the collection, we have so many examples of a young Buchwald engaging with writing as a means of self-expression and as a means of connecting with those around him. One very striking illustration of this is an excerpt from his social worker's case file in 1934, where she makes the observation that, and I'll quote here from the passage before you on the slide, Arthur's course in journalism seems exceptionally well suited to him, since he has been writing articles and stories for quite a long time. Although Arthur never mentioned to the worker, his sister told the worker that Arthur has been editing a family newspaper consisting of the doings of the foster family and their relatives for some time, end quote. This would have been when Buchwald was about 9 years old. At the age of 19, we have examples of him writing for his unit's newsletters, the Coral Carrier and the U-Man Comedy, while serving in the United States Marine Corps. And finally, we have my very favorite example of Buchwald writing academic papers as a student at the University of Southern California between 1946 and 1948. You can see clearly from the image before you on the right that Buchwald was not quite meeting the assignment criteria, but was certainly writing according to his own mind and style. It is unusual for a collection to come in with such thorough documentation of a person's evolution with their craft. This is just one of many aspects, but I think the most striking that makes the Buchwald collection such an intimate and rich view into his life and character. So with that, I will thank you for your time, and I will turn our program back over to Barbara so that we can hear from Mike.
Thank you so much, Colleen. And also a big thanks to the entire fantastic archival team who did such a superb job in processing the collection. Now, as Colleen mentioned, we're going to turn to a question and answer period with Mike about his writing of the book and some of his insights about the collection and how he used items from it. Mike, we've gotten an idea from Colleen how the archives team organized the collection for research use and how rich the resources are to choose from. What were some of the issues you faced in deciding how to organize the content in writing Funny Business? And what are some of your favorite items you featured from the library's collections?
Sure. Thank you so much, Barbara, for that very nice introduction. And I want to thank you and Colleen and her extraordinary team, first of all, for processing the collection, but also organizing it so well. And I could not have done the book in the time that I did it without all of the incredible work that you all did. And I'm so grateful to you. And I also want to thank Joel and Tamara Buchwald for not only initially preserving the collection, which is now on deposit at the Library of Congress, but also for their wonderful support and guidance and friendship over the last couple of years as I was able to write this just wonderful, marvelous book. In terms of the two issues, major issues that I was faced with, the first one, and this image on the screen is the final table of contents of the book. The first question was, like Colleen and her team, how to organize this all. And my initial idea was that I was only going to do a book of Art Buchwald's letters, which, as Colleen mentioned, that alone is an incredibly rich part of the whole collection. So I was only going to do his letters. But I started working on that, started trying to organize it and so forth. And what I realized pretty quickly was that it just didn't have any real focus. And also, most importantly, was that if I just did the letters, I was going to lose and leave out so many wonderful components and important components of Art's life and his career. So I decided to basically then structure it as painting a portrait of Art Buchwald, drawing upon the entire collection. And so the letters, of course, were a big part of that, but then also to be able to then draw upon so many of the riches of the rest of the collection, interviews, drafts of the columns, fan mail, looking at movies and photographs and so forth, to then develop this much more richer portrait of Art and his career. And the other big issue was permissions, was that I use a lot of Art's letters to friends and correspondence, but also I use a lot of letters from celebrities and politicians coming in. And those I could not use without permission from whoever wrote it or their literary executor. And Tamara was wonderful in helping secure a lot of permissions because she knew a lot of the people who wrote the letters. But for the people that she didn't, I then had to track down whoever the literary executor here was. And in some cases, that took me months to do it and to negotiate it. And so what I did was early on, that it probably would have delayed the release of the book because of that. There are a couple of favorites that I have. The first is a wonderful letter that Adam West, who many of you know, played Batman on the hit ABC TV series in the 60s, wrote to Art after Art wrote a column in the spring of 1966 when things were going bad for Lyndon Johnson and the Vietnam War. And the hit TV series was #1, that Art combined the two and suggested that Johnson might consider sending the dynamic duo to Vietnam to clean up his mess. And that column resulted in a letter from Adam West to Art Buchwald, not only telling him that he was a huge fan of his column and read it every morning, but he also offered to come to Art's aid if President Johnson retaliated against him after reading the column. And here's what Adam West Batman wrote in the final paragraph of this. If President Johnson gets out his axe after you, please rest assured that Robin and I will superjet to your aid on our multi-powered bat plane and do our stuff in full Technicolor. Sincerely, Adam West, Batman. And of course, he signs it as Batman at the bottom. That's one of my all-time favorites. And the next one is that in March of 1984, Dr. Seuss, who we all know and love, celebrated his 80th birthday, and Art was asked to write a toast for Dr. Seuss. And he wrote this wonderful little ditty to the master of Grinches and star-bellied Sneetches and cats in top hats with all that it teaches. That's also one of my favorites in the book. And the next one is some of the best correspondences between members of the Kennedy family and Art and Anne Buchwald, and particularly Ethel Kennedy. And this note on the right here is one of my favorites, and it shows the affection that Ethel Kennedy felt for both Art and Anne Buchwald. And she wrote this to them at Christmas time, 1975. And the note says, for Art and Anne, who make every day seem like Saturday and who always make me feel like I'm sailing. With Christmas love, Ethel Kennedy. So those are some of my favorites. There's tons and tons more. And the collection gave me so much to work with. And so I'm so grateful to all the work you did.
And we'll look at a few more things on some kind of pointed topics. Fame started for Art Buchwald really in Paris. What were some of the significant factors that you think about his Paris years?
Well, the biggest thing was that that's where he first started. He made his name as a celebrity columnist. And he spent about 14 years there, he and his wife, Anne, which is also where he met his wife, and they adopted their 3 children. But those 14 years was when he first started making his name as a celebrity columnist on both sides of the Atlantic. And it's also where he started to develop his style of writing as a on the right is a nice excerpt from one of Anne Buchwald's journals, where she lists several days in March 1954 where they had a party with the Bogarts. Art went to the races outside Paris with Bogey, and then they had dinner with him. So the Bogarts became very, very good friends. In addition to that, novelist Irwin Shaw became a lifetime friend. Ben Bradley, who was stationed there in Paris, who later became a lifelong friend. John Steinbeck and his wife, Elaine. And actually, there's a wonderful note that John Steinbeck wrote to Buchwald in 1953, just when he was getting going, telling him what a wonderful art he was developing as a columnist and his wonderful sense of humor. And that was one of the real jewels that I found in the collection, which is also in the book. And he also met Frank Sinatra, Ernest Hemingway. He did an exclusive interview with Elvis Presley. And after those 14 years, and I've done some talks that a lot of people who've come up to me telling me about the fact that when they were stationed in Paris in the 50s as a lawyer or a corporate executive or whatever, that Art Buchwald was what they read every day. And it really helped them survive their transition to Paris.
You mentioned that the family moved to Washington, D.C. in 1962, and at the time of when John F. Kennedy had come into the White House. One of the epigraphs that you use on the front of Funny Business is a quote from Dean Acheson, the former U.S. Secretary of State, saying Buchwald not only sees the world as mad, but that it is mad, gave him, as the British say, a leg up. Could you comment on Buchwald as a Washington insider who covered several White House administrations and eras?
Yes. Much as he had done in Paris, once he got to Washington, they got established in Washington, he then made all these new friendships with not only still Hollywood celebrities, but also with politicians. And this is a wonderful photograph from the Library of Congress collection of Art and Kay Graham. And they were such close friends. Kay Graham, of course, the owner and publisher of the Washington Post. And there was a wonderful letter that I found in the collection, which I use in the book, which is just, I loved it. That after Art won the Pulitzer in 1982, Catherine Graham wrote him a letter. Dear Art, for once I have no smart-ass comment to make besides congratulations on winning the Pulitzer. You deserve it, and much love. In addition to Catherine Graham, Ben Bradley, again, by this time was back in Washington, became a very, very dear close friend. And Edward Bennett Williams, the legendary lawyer, became a friend, but also the Kennedys became very close friends, particularly Ethel Kennedy.
Buchwald, for all his sometimes very targeted tongue-in-cheek lampooning, was an advocate for kindness. Could you comment on some of the ways Buchwald gave a leg up to others in his life?
Yeah, that's a good question, Barbara. And two things on that. One thing that I really found out when I started working on this book was not only could he be tough with his satire, but he also had an incredibly huge heart. And he was a dear, dear person. And he had so many close friends over the years. And this is a letter from the Library of Congress collection of Buchwald Papers that Art wrote to novelist Irwin Shaw, one of his closest friends going back to the Paris years, that Art wrote to Shaw just a couple weeks before Irwin Shaw died. And it's a beautiful letter which shows not only Art's heart, but also how much Irwin Shaw meant to him when he was trying to get started in Paris. And he says at one point, he says, I love you, Irwin, for being a friend and for what you did for me. And it's a beautiful letter. And about 2 weeks later, Irwin Shaw passed away. In addition to his deep friendships that he had, which I loved writing about, the other thing that Art Buchwald was really good about was that he was encouraging up and coming journalists, columnists, satirists who were going to follow in his wake. And I found a wonderful letter in the collection that Art had written, basically a fan letter to Maureen Dowd, that great columnist for the New York Times, and basically wrote a fan letter saying how wonderful he thought her writings were and her columns were. And it was just a nice thing to do. And also he was very encouraging to a lot of the other satirists that we now, that are still alive. Dave Barry, Barbara, you mentioned, and Dave Barry actually did a wonderful talk at Art's memorial service. Christopher Buckley, it was very encouraging to him, and I was so honored to have Christopher agree to write the foreword to this book. Carl Hyacint, and Art also was a very big early supporter of Gary Trudeau of Doonesbury fame, and as a matter of fact, Art wrote the first introduction to one of Gary Trudeau's collection of Doonesbury cartoons. So he was always there for a friend in need, but also very supportive of satirists and columnists on their way up.
And there's a small but wonderful file of the correspondence and the relationship with Gary Trudeau that is in the Art Buchwald Papers.
Yes.
And another person that's represented in the collections at the library would be Herbert Bloch, who was another friend of Art's. We have both the Herbert Bloch and Berryman cartoons that are part of the Prints and Photographs division. So that's an example of, other material at the library that is about political satire in a different form. Also Jules Pfeiffer's papers. And I'll also mention, going back to the Paris years, that we do have the Janet Flanner's papers and other people that he knew when he was in Paris. Part of the kindness that segues into my next question for you, Mike. What were some of the causes that were important to Art politically? And in what directions did he lend his philanthropy?
Yeah, in terms of some of the causes that he wrote some wonderful columns, and it was an opportunity doing this book to showcase some of those causes. He wrote a wonderful piece during the initial federal voting rights legislation, a satirical piece about the Southern literacy test. And it was heralded later as one of the best examples of using satire to make a really good political point. Gun control was a big issue that he wrote about, particularly because John F. Kennedy and his very good friend Robert Kennedy had been assassinated. So he wrote about gun control, and free speech was a huge issue to him. And one thing that he had to balance a lot was that he had all these Washington insider friendships, but he never let those friendships interfere with his writing of satire. And a couple of times he'd get involved in some dust-ups with friends. Slide you have up now is that Art every year would be a judge at the Kennedy Pet Show at Hickory Hill every year, and here's this picture of him in his judge's outfit giving an award cup to Robert and Ethel Kennedy, and also he would dress up every year as the Easter Bunny and go out there for these charitable causes that Ethel would do. And Colleen reminded me that there is some home movies in the collection of showing some of these events, which are just wonderful. And on the right is a photograph of Art and singer-songwriter Carly Simon. The other big cause Art was involved in until late in his life was that he summered on Martha's Vineyard, and every August he would do a what's called the Possible Dreams auction, where he would raise money for local community services for Martha's Vineyard. And Carly Simon was involved often in that. And one of the things that I found in the collection was that when Art was in his final years and everybody knew he was going to pass away, Carly Simon, a good friend, wrote a beautiful song to Art called Too Soon to Say Goodbye. And she recorded her singing that and sent a recording of it to Art. And Tamara Buchwald said that Art would ask her to play that over and over again, and it would always make him cry. And when I found it in the collection at the Library of Congress and listened to it, it made me cry. And later, when the book came out and Random House decided to do an audiobook, Miss Simon was very gracious in allowing to use her actual recording of her singing the song in the audiobook, which is very unusual for audiobooks. And it just shows how multidimensional aspects of an archival collection can not only help in developing a book, but also extending over into different formats, such as an audiobook in this case.
And if I'm remembering right, you reprint the lyrics for the song in the book, is that right?
Yes, exactly. And
so everyone can take a look and read them. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And that's another case of where a permission issue was involved. But also it was interesting, and it was a stylistic decision made, was that when they did the audiobook, we just talked about, would it be better to try and have her rendition of singing the song in the audiobook, or just have the narrator read the lyrics? And of course, the decision was hands down was if we could get permission to use her rendition, put that in. And it's incredible how it changes the whole tenor of that part of the book. And so I'm very grateful to her and for Random House for doing that.
And it's a beautiful story. Thank you for telling us.
Sure.
We see in your book many close relationships like this that Buchwald developed with key movers and shakers, and the way they express themselves in small private notes and messages, or in Carly Simon's case, that song. Could you mention some other key people you highlighted in the book and comment about Buchwald and friendship as a value in his life?
Yes, that's a really good point. He had, as I talked a little bit about before, he had a lot of high profile celebrity friends in Washington, D.C., the Kennedys, Edward Bennett Williams, Ben Bradley, Joseph Califano, Kay Graham. But he had other really close friends who weren't marquee names. And this is a wonderful photograph on the left of Art Buchwald on the right, Ben Bradley in the middle, and this great character by the name of Doc Dolinsky, who ran the Georgetown Pharmacy in the heart of Georgetown for ages and ages. And Doc Zelinsky was one of my favorite Buchwald friends to write about, because his pharmacy, by descriptions, it was like something out of a Sinclair Lewis general store in the Midwest. You'd walk into it and boxes and boxes of anything you can imagine was all over the place. They blocked aisles and so forth. But it was the place to go, and Art became a very good friend of Dr. Zelinsky's, not only their friendship, but seeking advice, but also key was gossip. That Art would say that whenever he came back from the vineyard at the end of the summer, one of the first places he went to was Dr. Zelinsky's store to get the latest gossip. But also on every Sunday, Doc held a buffet for his friends, coffee and bagels and other items and so forth, a private buffet. And Art, Ben Bradley would come, Kay Graham, Joseph Califano, but also they would bring celebrities who happened to be in town. John F. Kennedy Jr., when he was a senator who lived in Georgetown, used to come in and buy gifts for Caroline at Dr. Zelinsky's. But at this buffet, every Sunday, celebrities would show up. When All the President's Men was being filmed in Washington, Ben Bradley brought Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman to go to the buffet. So it was this wonderful, wonderful place. When Doc decided to retire in 1982, Art, of course, wanted to hold this celebration of his life. And this notice that's in the Buchwald Papers was sent out demanding the appearance of all of these friends of Dr. Zelinsky's to attend. And it was a wonderful occasion. Art said that novelist Herman Wouk flew in from Israel specifically for the Dr. Zelinsky occasion. And Art did this beautiful, beautiful toast, which I use in the book because the script of the toast is in the papers at the library.
And that's another wonderful example of the intersections between our different collections at the Library of Congress, because we also, in the Manuscript Division, hold the Herman Wouk Papers, another very large and rich collection, and other collections, of course, that with which he intersects. Another thing I like a lot about this is your final notice document, is it again shows how Art used various kinds of occasions to raise money for social welfare or other needs. And in this case, they turned the goodbye party into a fundraiser for a senior citizen food program in Georgetown, which had at the time been defunded by the DC government, and they were raising funds to keep it going. Yeah. So it's another example of his philanthropic sense, and also, the idea of them getting together. And in the picture, can you tell us who's in that photograph?
Yeah, Art's on the right, and then Ben Bradley is in the middle, and that's the esteemed Dr. Zelinsky on the left there. And it's great. It's perfect because they always describe him, no coat on, and his glasses always on his forehead, and so forth. And he's just a wonderfully. It was one of the most fun things is writing about Dr. Zelinsky in the book, because nobody remembers him, and he was so colorful, and Ben Bradley adored him, as did Art and Joe Califano.
And of course, there are certain jokes in the picture too, that Art's holding a book and Ben Bradley's reading the newspaper, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
A place to go to share the news. Yeah. Toward the last portion, we're going to get a little serious here. Toward the last portion of his life, Buchwald came out publicly as a person who suffered periodic bouts of depression. He joined with Martha Vineyard's pals, the novelist William Styron and journalist Mike Wallace, to speak publicly about mental health. And together they helped destigmatize seeking care for distress. We are hearing very much the same message today in our post-pandemic world. You write about this in the Tears of a Clown section of Funny Business. Buchwald also became an advocate for the hospice movement and the idea of dying with dignity and the rights of dying persons. As he once said, dying is an important part of life. What do you think was the impact of these stands at the time he made them? And how do you see them resonating in our own world today?
Very good question. Before I answer that, Barbara, I have to say, in the interest of full disclosure, the title of the last part of the book, Tears of the Clown, came from you. We were talking in the reading room one time about the book just as I was getting going, and we talked a little bit about his depression, and I didn't know virtually anything at that point about that. And you said, there's wonderful material in the collection. She goes, that might be a good name of a chapter called Tears of the Clown. And I noted that. And that's another great example about authors or researchers, or whatever. Talk to the archivist, because you always get something great from them. So thank you for the title of that final part of the book. Talking about Art's, that was, as I said, one of the things that I really didn't know anything about was Art's battle with depression. I always had this impression, I think a lot of people do, that he was like created by spontaneous combustion, where he just appeared on this world and was a funny man. But that is certainly not the case. He, throughout his life, struggled with depression, but he always worked through it and was able to obviously have an incredibly productive life. And his friends, Mike Wallace on the left and novelist William Styron on the right, all neighbors on Martha's Vineyard, they also battled depression. And the three of them, not only together, would try and help themselves deal with it. And this caption actually in the photograph is written, "Three Depressed Men." But in addition to helping themselves, one thing they started doing when they went public was that they would travel around the country, sometimes all together, billing themselves as the Blues Brothers, talking about their battles with depression. And the intent of that was to try and help other people who were not well known, who also battled depression, and to give a sense of you're not alone with this struggle. But just as importantly, that as you struggle, you can lead a productive and wonderful life. So I think what he did, and Mr. Styron and Mike Wallace did, was, by going public, was relieving that stigma, as you say, but also helping people deal with their own battle. And I know that in the collection, there are letters from ordinary people after he went public, basically saying, thank you for what you did, because you've helped me in my struggle with depression.
And did you have some thoughts about his support of basically the right to die and hospice movements?
Yeah, he it's an incredible story, because when he went into hospice, everybody thought he was going to probably die within a couple of weeks, if not, a month or so or whatever. But what happened is that incredibly, he soon became the man who wouldn't die. And when that happened, he decided to start giving interviews about being in a hospice and so forth. And so it was this that prior to that time, his celebrity had kind of gone off the radar a little bit, but that when he went public about his experiences in the hospice, that brought this whole new life to Buchwald as a celebrity. And he was being interviewed by everybody. New York Times, Diane Rehm did one of the first initial interviews with him. New York Times, Washington Post, every newspaper, television wanted to do, I think 60 Minutes did a thing about that. And he was wonderful about it, again, about promoting hospice care. And then the other thing too was that it showed in those interviews that he did that Art Buchwald, when things really got tough, Art Buchwald never lost his sense of humor. And in these interviews, he was just a riot. One of the quotes that he had was that a friend of his visited one of the hospice healthcare facilities in Georgetown, and Art asked him, he said, "Did you have any difficulty parking?" And when the friend said, "Yes, in fact, I did," Art said, "Well, parking's impossible. Dying is easy." So he never lost his sense of humor. And again, that was an example to people that even when things are difficult, if you maintain a sense of humor, it can be such a wonderful, wonderful thing.
I think another thing he said in that period when he was in hospice that well, he had nothing else to do but do interviews from his bed, but that he was in a way helping the other people that were
Yes.
also there, and
Yeah.
giving them hope and humor. And then the miraculous thing is that his kidney began to function again,
Yes,
and he was able to
exactly.
leave hospice for a while, and
Yeah.
and
Went up to the vineyard. Yeah,
and then going up to the vineyard, wrote his final book, and then died at home. And I, as a former hospice worker before I came to the Library of Congress, that aspect of his life really resonates for me. I'd like to close up our to and fro kind of part of the program with a question about art's relevance to today. The world may be continually mad in different ways, and the way it is satirized also changes. What do you think Art Buchwald would be like in a world of social media and podcasts? How do late night comics and talk show hosts and shows like Saturday Night Live or Comedy Central play a role similar to what art did to basically make us think while we're laughing, but also carry the news in a certain kind of analytic way?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and I've been asked that, and I've thought about it. First response is that if he were alive today, he would be very active on Twitter, Facebook, all the other social media things, and he'd be incredible at it. He'd be wonderful at it, because one of the things I realized again when I started working on this was that, like any great comedian, he could throw a good punch, he could take a punch, and then he could throw a good punch back. So he would have been perfect for Twitter and social media because he was so quick-witted. But having said that, he always had a rule that he was never mean-spirited. He said that countless times in interviews, that he could be tough, he could be sharp, but he was never mean-spirited with his humor or satire. And I think, unfortunately, that's a little bit of difference of some of what we're doing today. But having said that, I think there's some great satirists in the Buchwald mold still out there today. I mentioned Dave Barry, Christopher Buckley, Carl Hiaasen, and Trevor Noah, and Jon Stewart when he was on. I think we're all that. And it was interesting, your question about the pandemic and all that. I had just before the book came out, I had a wonderful interview with David Smith, the Washington, D.C. correspondent for The Guardian. And he told me at one point that when he was locked down during the pandemic in his house, that part of what kept his sanity was watching Stephen Colbert's monologues every night and getting some laughs and getting some humor. And so he felt that was one way, again, kind of like Art Buchwald did. Because he said at one point in an interview in the late 60s, he said, we're a very uptight country now. And if there's anything that I'm doing, it's maybe with my humor, letting a little bit of the steam off. And I think if he were still with us today, with our uptight country and divisive country, he'd do the same thing. So use his humor to try and take a little bit of the steam and uptight nature out of our society and our culture now.
I'm looking now in the Q&A that we've received, and someone has offered a kind of story from her own life, and I'm going to read it. Not a question, just an anecdote. You're welcome to share. I was one of those young people looking for a journalism career many years ago. In 1984, when I was 24 and working for local newspapers and radio stations in Connecticut, I came to Washington to knock on doors looking for a job. I didn't need to knock on Art's door. It was literally open. I walked in and found him at his desk, his office cluttered with papers, books, and boxes. I introduced myself and explained that I was visiting Washington looking for a career in journalism. I asked if he needed office help or an assistant, or would he have any advice for someone looking for a job. Without missing a beat, he replied, "Sweetheart, if I knew you were coming, I would have cleaned the office." He was incredibly kind, stopping whatever he was doing to take time to give me pointers on advancing my career. His advice ultimately led me to a 30-year career in the news business at Voice of America.
Wow, that's a wonderful story.
It is a wonderful story. Thank you for
Wonderful.
sharing that. I'm not naming your name because I don't know if you want to be named, but thank you for sharing that story.
Yeah, and that echoes the whole thing about he was always very supportive of people, trying to make it in the business, and always took time and so forth. And he wasn't competitive. He was just wonderful.
I wonder if this audience member would share what the advice was. I'd be curious to know.
If you want to share what the advice was, you can type it back into the Q&A and we'll take a look at it. If there aren't any more questions, we could wrap up. Or Colleen, did you have any questions you wanted to ask Mike that maybe came to mind while we were talking?
You're putting me on the spot, Barbara.
I did.
I was wondering, Mike, if you had any thoughts about Buchwald's difficult childhood and how that influenced his humor later on in life. I know you go into it in the book a bit, but if you wanted to speak to the audience about it today, that was an aspect of his life that I wasn't aware of that really resonated with me as we process the collection. There's very good documentation of sort of the difficulties he faced as a young child and a young adult. So if you would speak to that.
Sure, and that's a great question. Just try and give a nutshell is that his early childhood, it was really, really bleak and difficult. Right after he was born, his mother had to be committed to an asylum, so he never really knew his mother. And he was told that she had died, but then later found out that she hadn't died. And then he had 3 older sisters, and his father, who was in the drapery business, could not afford to pay the asylum bills for his wife, and also to raise the 3 kids. So through social services, the Art and the sisters were all sent to a series of foster homes. And so that's where some of the social reports that you referred to, Colleen, were that they would have social workers come and check up on Art. And several of the things came out of that. One was that he says in one of his memoirs that with the bleakness of his life all around him, what he realized early on was that being a funny man made people like him. And so there's a quote in one of his memoirs where he says about his early life, he said, "This stinks, I'm going to become a humorist." And so that was something he remembered and used all of his life to be funny, to make people like him. And so that was one quality that came out of that. The other was a sense of independence. And I'm sure that what surprised me about some of the early social worker reports was the fact that they talked about how independent he was. And indeed he was, that he would take off and he would go to New York City on his own, and he would go to hang out in hotels and just observe people. And he developed this wonderful sense of observation about people. So early on, he became very independent and very strong-willed. And ultimately, when his father was able to afford bringing all the kids back when he was in high school, by that time, Art was so independent that it was very difficult for him to be all part of that. And then what happened was, even before he graduated from high school, World War II broke out. And he was not old enough, but he got some forged papers to basically enlist in the Marine Corps, which he said was one of the great experiences of his life, because it really kind of helped shape him as a person. So that bleakness of his life, and his doctor, Michael Newman, told me later, he said that in terms of his depression afterwards, his battles with depression, that those early years, just the haunting experience of that kept coming back to him with feelings of guilt and so forth. And then those would result in his breakdowns, basically. And then he would slowly work his way out of that dark abyss.
We are running out of time when we need to wrap up, but I did want to mention that Colleen did a wonderful blog for the Veterans History Project about Art and the Marines. And the Marines is sort of what he once famously said, the Marines were my father. that, that's where he got a sense of family with the other guys in the military, and that it kind of made him straighten up and fly right.
Yeah.
I'm going to wrap up now. I want to thank you both so much for the presentations today. And one of the things that Art Buchwald often said was, whether it is the best of times or the worst of times, it is the only time we have. And this is such a reminder to us, as for us all, to make the most of the life we have as we are living it.
Yeah.
We've reached the end of our time in the program together today. And if you have questions that were not answered during the session and during our conversation, please feel free to contact us through the Ask a Librarian reference portal available on the Library of Congress website. We encourage those listening to read and enjoy Mike Hill's book, Funny Business, to laugh and remember Art Buchwald and consider his ongoing relevance today, and also to come take a look for themselves as researchers in the Manuscript Division reading room. There are plenty of gems still waiting to be discovered in the Art Buchwald collection at the Library of Congress, and more projects to be made at the library. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day, everybody.